Welcome to the deep dive. Today, we're plunging into a world that covers over 70% of our planet, the oceans.
Right. And their influence, well, it's profound, isn't it?
hmm
Often taken for granted.
Totally. Think about it, how much of our global story, from ancient migrations right up to modern conflicts, is basically written on the waves. It's
Yeah.
it's way more than you might first imagine.
Indeed. And to guide us through this huge topic, we're drawing from a really incredible source. Admiral James Stavridis' book, Sea Power: The History and Geopolitics of the World's Oceans.
And this isn't just some dry academic study, is it?
Not at all. It's more like a living narrative. It comes from a mariner, someone who has actually experienced the world's waters firsthand.
That's the key point, I think. Admiral Sturrius, he's a highly decorated U.S. Navy admiral, well, a really seasoned sailor who's literally traversed all the world's major oceans. So his insights aren't just theoretical.
Exactly. They're steeped in this deep personal understanding of what it means to be at sea. He mentioned starting out at 18, a midshipman, learning navigation.
Right, from an instructor who taught him not just the science of it, but also this idea that all oceans are connected, like one single entity.
Yeah, and that perspective, it really anchors his whole view of sea power. He felt he was part of a long, unbroken chain of men and women who have set their course for the open ocean.
So what's really fascinating here is the admiral's core idea, isn't it? This dual perspective.
It is. He argues that to really get the sea, you need to understand two things. First, the big picture, the sweeping geopolitics, how oceans shape international events.
And second,
And second, the really personal experience. What's it like for the mariner at sea? The day-to-day life, the challenges, the bonds you form on a ship, and how that individual human voyage connects to the huge strategic impact of the water world.
okay, so that's our mission for you today. We want to unpack this fascinating dual perspective. We're going to try and extract the most important nuggets of knowledge, maybe some surprising facts, about how the sea has driven and, continues to drive the international system.
We'll explore some of the major oceans and specific seas, drawing heavily on the Admiral's own stories, his personal experiences, and the rich history he presents in the book.
All right, let's dive in. And where better to start than the biggest one, the Pacific.
The Pacific. He calls it the mother of all the oceans, and you could tell it holds a really special place for him. He talks about this epiphany he had.
Oh, yeah. When was that?
It was back in 1972. He first sailed into the Pacific on the USS Chouette. He describes the ship nosing out of San Diego, him stepping onto the bridge, and just being hit by the sheer vastness of it. The sun, the salt air.
It's intense.
He says it was a moment like St. Paul on the road to Damascus. He just knew right then, I wanted to be a sailor. And that personal awakening, it really grounds his whole exploration of this immense ocean.
And immense is the right word. It's bigger than all the land masses on Earth put together.
Yeah, the scale is just mind-boggling. He uses this great analogy, flying from Washington, D.C. to Honolulu.
Right, you spend more time flying over the Pacific than you do crossing the entire U.S. mainland.
Exactly. And what's also striking is how little land there actually is in the Pacific.
Yeah.
Just these scattered islands, Oceania.
Which makes the human story there even more incredible, doesn't it?
Oh, absolutely. Those ancient Austronesian migrations.
hmm
People island hopping thousands of miles from East Asia all the way out to Hawaii. Imagine the ingenuity, the courage, the sheer willpower involved.
Using pretty basic technology too, right?
Extremely basic compared to now. He reflects on this during his own first Pacific crossing in the late 70s. He remembers they were still doing principal navigation, using sextants and paper charts. I mean, it was a real challenge, especially when you think about today's GPS.
Definitely puts things in perspective. But the Pacific's history isn't just about migration. It's also full of, well, exploration and some pretty big miscalculations.
Like Magellan.
Exactly. Ferdinand Magellan, trying to circumnavigate the globe, he famously thought the Pacific was only, 600 miles wide?
Yeah, just a slight miscalculation, off by over 10,000 miles. It highlights how little they understood, the sheer scale they were facing. And ultimately, that miscalculation cost him his life in the Philippines.
Then you have figures like Captain James Cook.
Cook. Stavridis calls him perhaps the greatest of all the Pacific sailors in history.
High praise.
Well-deserved, I think. This Yorkshire farm boy, as Stavridis puts it, had this obsession with the sea. He made 3 epic voyages between 1768 and 1779.
On ships like the Endeavour, Discovery.
Resolution, Adventure.
Yeah.
Yeah, he covered over 150,000 sea miles. Think about that. He charted practically every important Pacific port, from Alaska all the way down to Tasmania. He essentially opened up an ocean that was, for Europeans anyway, largely unexplored.
It wasn't just the British and Spanish, though. The Russians had to go, too, didn't they?
They did. They carved out claims in Alaska, driven by the fur trade, and even operated as far south as Fort Ross, just north of San Francisco in the early 19th century.
But that didn't last.
No, it was pretty transitory. It led to the sale of Alaska to the U.S. in 1867, a deal that was actually mocked quite a bit in the U.S. at the time, Seward's folly.
Funny how history judges those things. So how did the U.S. really get involved in the Pacific as a major power?
Initially, it was whaling, but then the really lucrative China trade took over. That drove interest. But the big technological shift was coal power in the 1860s.
The need for fuel.
Precisely. Steamships needed coaling stations, regular stops. And that need, according to Stavridis, drove the U.S. annexation of Hawaii in 1898. Pearl Harbor became the absolute fulcrum of American presence in the Pacific.
Which, of course, sets the stage for later conflicts, especially with Japan.
Right. You had Commodore Perry opening Japan in 1853, using what Stavridis calls a soft power approach, diplomacy backed by the potential for force, rather than just steaming in guns blazing.
And Japan responded by modernizing incredibly quickly.
Astonishingly fast. They industrialized, built a powerful military, and suddenly the Pacific wasn't this vast, empty buffer zone anymore. For Japan, it became a potential zone of conquest.
Leading to things like the Russo-Japanese War.
Yeah, 1904, 1905. A really critical turning point, actually. Stavridis points out it was the last major naval war where captains still practiced the age-old tradition of striking colors, surrendering their ship.
What happened?
Well, when those Russian commanders who surrendered got back home, they were court-martialed, dishonored, and that basically ended the idea of honorable surrender in modern navies. From then on, the ethos became, don't give up the ship. Sink with it, maybe, but don't surrender it.
Wow. That's a major shift in naval culture.
It is. And it connects to that personal story the Admiral tells about sailing into Pearl Harbor in the late 70s.
As an experienced officer.
Yeah, a deck watch officer.
Yeah.
He describes it as blowing hard, difficult conditions. He almost swung the stern of his destroyer into a channel buoy, making a too tight turn.
Ouch! Bet the captain wasn't thrilled.
Definitely not. But the captain used it as a teaching moment. He shared a quote from Admiral Ernest King. The mark of a great ship handler is never getting into a situation requiring great ship handling.
Meaning, anticipate, plan, don't get yourself into trouble in the first place.
Exactly. A lesson Stavridis says he never forgot. And a lesson that resonates when you think about the strategic surprise at Pearl Harbor itself in 1941.
The attack that brought the U.S. into World War II? Devastating.
Absolutely devastating. Though, crucially, the U.S. aircraft carriers were out at sea and spared. The battleships, however, were pounded, many sunk or badly damaged right at their moorings.
Which forced a change in naval strategy, didn't it? Away from battleships towards carriers.
It absolutely did, and it led directly to the pivotal Battle of Midway just 6 months later. Stavridis calls it a real cat-and-mouse game.
How so?
Well, the American carriers managed to remain hidden. There was a Japanese reconnaissance plane that was supposed to spot them, but it had a mechanical failure, launched late.
Just pure luck, really.
A huge element of luck and chance. The result was the American planes caught the Japanese carriers at their most vulnerable moment. Decks full of planes being rearmed, switching from bombs for land targets to torpedoes for ships. It was a catastrophe for the Japanese Navy. They lost 4 of their best carriers in a single day.
Changed the course of the war in the Pacific.
Completely. Stavridis quotes a Japanese naval officer, Masataka Okumiya, who said something really telling afterwards. The Pacific War was started by men who did not understand the sea and fought by men who did not understand the air. Captures the strategic blindness, doesn't it?
It really does. So bringing it up to the modern day, we hear a lot about the Pacific Century. Is that how the Admiral sees it?
He acknowledges the idea. I mean, the region boasts most of the world's largest and most powerful countries, economically and demographically.
Yeah.
The Obama administration even talked about a pivot to the Pacific, later a rebalance. The economic center of gravity is certainly shifting.
But it's not all smooth sailing, is it? There are significant risks.
Definitely. Stavridis highlights the increasingly tense state of the ongoing arms race around the Pacific as a major concern. He points to defense spending figures from a few years back, Asia rising significantly while U.S. and European spending dipped.
China being a major factor there.
A huge factor. China's shift from what they call peaceful development to active defense. They've developed very capable anti-ship missiles, like the DF-21D, specifically designed to threaten aircraft carriers. And they're building their own carriers now, too.
So it changes the whole strategic calculation for the U.S. Navy.
Absolutely. But it's not just China. Japan increased its defense budget for the first time in a decade around that time. South Korea is focused on missile defense. Australia is investing in combat aircraft and submarines. India's military budget is growing significantly with a push to make in India. It's a complex, multipolar arm dynamic.
Beyond the military buildup, what other risks does he see in the Pacific?
Several big ones. Overfishing is a huge problem. Illegal, unreported, unregulated fishing, or IUU fishing. Human pollution, exemplified by that infamous Texas-sized island of plastic debris swirling in the currents, and the increasing frequency and intensity of typhoons, likely linked to climate change.
So potential military conflict, environmental degradation. What's the way forward? How do we avoid the worst outcomes?
Stavridis puts a lot of emphasis on avoiding the Thucydides trap. That's the idea from the ancient Greek historian that conflict often becomes inevitable when a rising power challenges an established one, largely due to fear and miscalculation.
So how do you avoid the trap?
His answer is essentially maritime diplomacy. Consistent, high-level conversations between the U.S. and China, especially about friction points like the South China Sea, strengthening cooperation among allies to Japan, South Korea, the Philippines, Australia, using joint military exercises like RIMPAC not just for warfighting practice, but for confidence building, getting navies used to operating near each other safely.
And soft power.
And soft power, definitely. Things like disaster relief operations, medical diplomacy, building goodwill, and demonstrating capability in non-threatening ways. The hope, he says, is that the Pacific can live up to its name, peaceful. A lot riding on that hope. Okay, let's shift oceans now. You mentioned the Indian Ocean earlier, calling it the future sea. Why that title?
Well, historically speaking, compared to the Atlantic or the Pacific, the Indian Ocean didn't have the same kind of global geopolitical weight for centuries. It was, as Stavridis puts it, relatively a tabula rasa in geopolitical terms. It was important regionally, of course, for trade, but didn't dominate great power competition in the same way.
Until recently.
Exactly, until the rise of global shipping on a massive scale, and crucially, the dependence on oil exports from the Arabian Gulf or Persian Gulf, depending on who you ask. And now, he argues, its importance is set to surge again as India rises as a major global player.
So the future is unfolding there. What was the Admiral's first experience of it? He first entered the Indian Ocean in the mid-1980s. He was the operations officer on a brand new warship, the USS Valley Forge, an AGIS air defense cruiser. He describes the transit through the Strait of Malacca.
Which is incredibly busy, right? One of the world's major shipping choke points.
Extremely busy. He calls the night watch a blur of huge tankers, tiny coastal junks, fishing boats, other warships, intense. But then, once they got past Singapore and into the open Indian Ocean, he felt that same sense of vastness he'd felt in the Pacific. He says a sailor is hit by a sense of wide open space, much like the Central and Western Pacific.
Geographically, how does he describe the Indian Ocean?
He points out it's essentially one massive littoral, meaning lots of coastline relative to its size.
Yeah.
And it has two crucial inland seas branching off it, the Arabian Gulf and the Red Sea leading to the Suez Canal.
And the trade routes there are ancient.
Millennia old. Focused initially on high-value goods, spices like pepper and cinnamon, pearls, luxurious carpets, even horses. And very early on, traders figured out how to harness the monsoon winds for predictable seasonal voyages.
You mentioned the strategic choke points, Hormuz.
The Strait of Hormuz, guarding the entrance to the Arabian Gulf. Its strategic value was recognized way back. Stavridis draws a plumb line from the ancient Persians building forts there to control trade, right up to the intense focus on that narrow waterway today because of oil transit.
And the Gulf itself became a real hotspot, particularly during the Admiral's time there in the 80s.
Yes, he describes his work during Operation Earnest Will as harrowing. This was during the Iran-Iraq War, and the U.S. Navy was escorting reflagged Kuwaiti oil tankers through the Gulf to protect them from attack.
These tankers are enormous, right?
Huge. He says they were 10 times our size by tonnage. He stood tension-filled watches as the tactical action officer, constantly ready to launch missiles to defend these tankers against attacks from, as he puts it, an unpredictable Iran and a miscalculating Iraq. High stakes.
And there was that tragic incident involving the USS Vincennes.
Yes, he mentions that. The Vincennes was his relief ship on station. In 1988, it mistakenly shot down an Iranian commercial airliner, Iran Air Flight 655, killing all 290 people on board. A terrible tragedy, driven by the fog of war and misidentification in a highly tense environment. He notes a monument to the victims is still visible from the sea today.
A stark reminder. How does he see the Gulf today?
He describes it as a distinct Islamic sea, geographically quite small, only about 600 miles long, but it's a major fault line. There's this constant cat-and-mouse game between the naval forces of Shia Iran on one side and the Sunni Arab states, like Saudi Arabia, the UAE, Bahrain on the other.
With the U.S. Navy right in the middle.
Right in the middle. The U.S. Fifth Fleet, headquartered in Bahrain, is actually the largest of all the U.S. global fleets. It's there to maintain stability, ensure freedom of navigation, especially for oil tankers, but it's caught in the middle of this deep-seated Sunni-Shia rivalry that, he says, gives every impression of being capable of leading to outright conflict.
It's amazing to think that this region, now so critical because of energy, was basically a resource-poor body of water that slept its way through the millennia.
It is quite the transformation. Before oil and natural gas were discovered, and the Gulf holds about two-thirds of the world's proven oil reserves and a third of its gas, it was mostly pearl diving and fishing. Now you have these incredibly modern, sophisticated commercial hubs like Dubai, Abu Dhabi, Doha, Bahrain, built almost entirely on energy wealth.
The Suez Canal is another key feature related to the Indian Ocean, connecting it to the Med. The Admiral had a story about that too, didn't he?
He did, a very telling one about leadership and trusting your people.
Mm-hmm.
It was his first time commanding a ship through the Suez Canal. He was a relatively young captain, 38 years old, on a 9,000-ton destroyer.
And they have local pilots guide them through, right?
Yes, mandatory Egyptian pilots come aboard. At a critical point, the pilot gave an order for a turn. But the Admiral's young officer of the deck, a 26-year-old Annapolis graduate named Lieutenant Chadwick, immediately countermanded the order. Chadwick knew the pilot's order was wrong, that it would have put the ship aground. He trusted his own navigation, his training, his instruments over the supposed local expert. The Admiral backed his lieutenant. They ignored the pilot's frantic protests, and Chadwick steered them safely through.
Wow, that takes guts, especially from a junior officer overruling an experienced pilot.
It does, and the Admiral uses it to make a point. In critical moments, you have to trust your training, trust your instruments, and crucially, trust your own well-trained crew, sometimes even over the outside experts.
That's a powerful lesson. Shifting focus slightly, the Indian Ocean was also the scene of that devastating 2004 tsunami. How did sea power play a role there?
In a humanitarian way. The tsunami killed somewhere between 200,000 and 300,000 people across the region. It was catastrophic. Admiral Stavridis describes watching the U.S. military response unfold from the Pentagon Command Center.
What did they do?
They marshaled this huge logistic, humanitarian, and medical capability incredibly quickly. Under Lieutenant General Rusty Blackman, ships, aircraft, personnel poured into the region. The Admiral talks about seeing sailors, Marines, airmen, soldiers wading into the water, rescuing people, delivering aid. He said it was deeply moving.
An example of soft power.
A prime example.
Mm-hmm.
He specifically mentions the deployment of the Navy's massive hospital ships, the USNS Mercy and USNS Comfort. Each is about 60,000 tons, basically a floating state-of-the-art hospital. He argues that missions like that, humanitarian assistance and disaster relief, can do more for our security than the combat cruises of our nuclear aircraft carriers.
That's a strong statement.
It is. He calls finding that balance between hard power and soft power smart power, using all the tools available, not just the military ones.
Another major issue in the Indian Ocean, particularly off Somalia, was piracy. The Admiral dealt with that directly when he commanded NATO, right?
He did. He took command in 2009, and initially he admits piracy wasn't top of his priority list. But he quickly realized its impact was huge.
Financially?
Financially, yes. It was costing the global transport network somewhere between $15 and $20 billion a year through ransoms, delays, insurance, security measures. But there was also a connection to terrorism, with suggestions that some ransom money was flowing to groups like al-Shabaab in Somalia.
So how did they tackle it?
It required a massive international effort. NATO, the European Union, individual countries like Russia, China, India, Pakistan, even Iran, all contributed ships and aircraft. It became this rare zone of cooperation in maritime security.
Patrolling a huge area.
Immense. An area roughly the size of Europe. They used long-range maritime patrol aircraft like P-3 Orions and AWACS airborne surveillance planes to spot pirate skiffs far out at sea. But it was challenging. And there was this epical dilemma.
What to do with captured pirates?
Exactly. He says the desire for rough justice, like string them up from a yardarm, was there, but reality was complex. These were often very young Somali men, poor, addicted to the stimulant drug cot, often without any capers. Prosecuting them was legally difficult.
Did the shipping industry adapt?
Hugely. They changed routes, traveled in convoys, put up physical barriers like razor wire. They developed tactics to evade boarding, and crucially, many ships installed citadels.
Safe rooms.
Basically, yeah. Secure rooms where the crew could lock themselves in if pirates boarded, and then use satellite phones to call for help. The movie Captain Phillips gives a vivid and accurate portrayal of that whole situation, according to the Admiral.
But what really changed the game?
The decision by shipping companies to start using armed security details on board their vessels, often private military contractors. Stavridis admits this made traditional military folks nervous, mixing civilian contractors with military operations, and describes it as having a bit of a Mad Max quality.
But did it work?
Strikingly well. He states that no ship embarking in armed security detail has ever been successfully hijacked. The pirates were typically lightly armed, often just with AK-47s and RPGs, and trying to board a massive high-sided tanker or container ship while being shot at by trained security personnel proved incredibly difficult, almost impossible.
So, looking ahead for the Indian Ocean, what are the key takeaways?
Its role in the 21st century is absolutely crucial. Key flashpoints remain. India-Pakistan tensions, particularly over Kashmir. China's growing influence, seeking naval bases and access across the region, the string of pearls strategy, and that persistent Sunni-Shia conflict centered on the Arabian-Persian Gulf, with conflicts like Yemen fueling regional instability.
And the U.S. role?
Continued strong naval and air presence, joint exercises with key partners like India, Exercise Malabar is a big one, ongoing counter-piracy efforts, active diplomacy to try and tamp down tensions, and significant involvement in the Gulf to ensure freedom of the high seas and keep that critical sea lane of communication through the Strait of Hormuz open.
Okay, a complex and increasingly vital region. Let's sail north now to the pop of the world, the Arctic Ocean. Cerise calls this chapter Promise and Peril. Why that duality?
Well, the Arctic has always been this zone of mystery, hasn't it? For centuries, people imagined what might be up there. Early maps sometimes showed habitable zones. Myths of open polar seas persisted. Even the Santa Claus myth taps into that sense of a hidden, almost magical realm at the North Pole.
But the reality was always ice.
Ice, extreme cold, darkness. For most of history, it was largely inaccessible. Stavridis points out we probably know more about the surface of the Moon or Mars than we do about the bottom of the Arctic Ocean.
It's the smallest ocean, isn't it?
It is the smallest of the world's 5 oceans. But locked away beneath that ice and now becoming accessible is an enormous trove of treasure. Natural resources, oil, gas, minerals potentially shorter, more efficient sea lanes, and new geopolitical terrain opening up. That's the promise.
And the peril.
The peril comes from how it's becoming accessible. The rapidly melting ice due to climate change. This is the dramatic transformation. Stavridis cites projections that by around 2040, we could see an open passage for essentially 12 months of the year through routes like the Northwest Passage. And maybe a decade after that, there might no longer be ice over the North Pole during the summer melt season.
That's staggering.
It is. And the irony, he points out, is that the Northwest Passage, this route explorers like Franklin died searching for over centuries, is finally opening up, not because of exploration, but because of pollution and global warming.
He gives some stats on the ice melt,
Yeah,
right?
comparing average sea ice cover in 2012 to the average from 1980 to 2000, it was down by 1.3 million square miles. That's a colossal amount of ice vanishing. And you see the impact already. Traffic through the Bering Strait, connecting the Pacific to the Arctic, increased 120% just between 2008 and 2012.
The Admiral actually sailed up there, didn't he? Became a blue nose.
He did. He talks about sailing into the Arctic on the destroyer USS Spruance early in his career, testing anti-submarine warfare gear in those extreme conditions. Crossing the Arctic Circle earned sailors a Blue Nose certificate, a sort of unofficial badge of honor.
But he also goes into detail about submarine operations under the ice, which sounds incredible.
It really does. He describes how nuclear submarines can actually break through the ice pack to surface right at the North Pole. It's incredibly dangerous. They have to worry about these massive, unseen, dangling ice keels extending deep underwater.
How do they find a safe spot?
They use upward-looking sonar to map the underside of the ice, searching for a relatively thin, flat spot. Then they slowly, carefully rise. He describes the process as very quiet, controlled, until you hear the crunching sound of the ice on the hull as the sub pushes through.
And then they pot up at the top of the world.
Pretty much. He adds a detail about sailors having to emerge cautiously to safely avoid polar bears that sometimes amble right up to the submarine hull out of curiosity. It's a vivid picture of a truly unique and challenging operating environment.
So this opening Arctic creates huge geopolitical questions. Resources.
Absolutely. There's a growing commercial sense of an oil and gas rush up north, and the geography of potential reserves is stark. Savridis notes that based on current assessments, nearly 80% of the proven reserves of the Arctic will be in Russian hands. Russia has by far the longest Arctic coastline.
Which raises the potential for conflict, doesn't it? Militarization.
That's a huge part of the peril. He sees a real danger of militarizing the high north, potentially leading to a new and colder Cold War, especially with current tensions between NATO and Russia being what they are. 4 of the 5 key Arctic coastal states, US, Canada, Denmark, Greenland, Norway, are NATO members. Russia is the 5th, making it an uneasy partner in Arctic governance.
But there's an even bigger environmental danger he highlights, beyond just the melting ice itself.
Yes, and this is crucial. It's the thawing permafrost, the permanently frozen ground around the Arctic Circle, both on land and under shallow seas. As it thaws, it releases enormous amounts of trapped methane gas.
And methane is a potent greenhouse gas.
Extremely potent, much more so than CO2 in the short term. Stavridis explains a frightening feedback loop. For every 1 degree Celsius the planet warms globally, the North Pole region warms about 5 degrees Celsius. This accelerates permafrost thaw, releasing more methane, which causes more warming. He warns this could immediately overshoot the carbon budget the world agreed to aim for in the Paris Climate Accords, potentially triggering runaway global warming and disaster.
That sounds apocalyptic. So what's the way forward for the U.S. and the world in the Arctic?
For the U.S. specifically, Stavridis is blunt. It needs more icebreakers. He calls them the path to credibility in the Arctic. At the time of writing, the U.S. had only one truly functional heavy icebreaker, the Polar Star, compared to dozens operated by Russia. He argues a coherent U.S. strategy requires a fleet of maybe 4 heavy and 4 medium icebreakers to maintain presence, support science, and perform rescue missions.
Beyond hardware.
Leadership in the Arctic Council is key. That's the main international forum for Arctic governance. It includes the 8 Arctic states, plus observers like China, India, Japan, South Korea, Singapore, reflecting the growing global interest. Enhancing dialogue, especially with Russia despite other tensions, is vital because they have such a significant stake, and fostering international, interagency, and public-private cooperation is crucial for things like developing emergency response capabilities and building sustainable infrastructure responsibly.
It seems the Arctic really encapsulates that promise and peril title, a region opening up with huge potential but also immense risks, both geopolitical and environmental.
Absolutely. It forces us to confront some very difficult choices about resource exploitation versus environmental protection, and competition versus cooperation.
Okay, this leads us nicely into another major theme. The Admiral raises what he terms the outlaw sea. What does he mean by that?
He uses this term to cover areas where governance is weak or non-existent, and where illicit activities thrive, often hidden from view. He focuses on 2 main areas: criminal activity, like piracy and illegal fishing, and the pervasive problem of environmental damage. These are, in his words, potentially very destructive zones.
We touched on piracy earlier with Somalia, but he sees it as a broader issue.
Yes, he revisits it here more broadly. Piracy is ancient, of course, think Roman Mediterranean, Caribbean buccaneers, Strait of Malacca historically. But the modern resurgence isn't just Somalia. He mentions hotspots in the Gulf of Guinea off West Africa, lingering issues in Malacca and the South China Sea, and even some problems in the Caribbean. The global cost remains huge, that $15–20 billion annual figure.
And the response tactics we discussed, coalitions, industry adaptations, armed guards, apply more generally.
Generally, yes. He reiterates the complexity of dealing with captured pirates, the legal black holes. He highlights the shipping industry's own innovations, routing, convoys, physical barriers, those citadels, and again emphasizes the game-changing impact of private armed security details, despite the initial reluctance from military circles. That point about no ship with armed guards being successfully hijacked is powerful.
What about other crime? He mentioned illegal fishing.
Illegal, unreported, and unregulated fishing, IUU fishing. He paints this as a global crisis. Fish stocks are under severe pressure worldwide due to overfishing. He cites figures like more than 60% of all fish stocks worldwide being fully exploited or depleted. Tuna stocks down 50% from their peak. It's alarming. He quotes someone saying, oceans are cleared at twice the rate of forests.
What drives IUU fishing?
A combination of factors. Destructive practices like bottom trawling, which scrapes the seabed clean. Governments sometimes turning a blind eye because cracking down is politically difficult or impacts local economies. And a major enabler is the use of flags of convenience. Registering ships in countries that have lax regulations and enforcement. Maybe small island nations that offer registration for a fee but don't really monitor the vessels. He estimates maybe 1,000 to 2,000 large fishing vessels operate under these flags, facilitating billions of dollars in illegal fishing activities. It makes tracking and accountability incredibly hard.
He uses a strong analogy for this, doesn't he?
He does. Think of the oceans as a kind of war zone in which there are daily atrocities, horrifying collateral damage, and no rule of law. It really conveys the scale and severity of the problem.
But he argues there's an even bigger crime happening at sea.
Yes, the willful and preventable damage to the environment. He calls this the biggest act of criminal behavior on the oceans, and ultimately the biggest threat we face as a species. Why? Because it's robbing future generations of their birthright, a healthy planet.
This sounds like something he feels very strongly about personally.
You get that sense. He shares his own journey on this. He says his awakening really began when he was studying at the Fletcher School of Law and Diplomacy in the mid-'80s. He started to realize how, for years, the Navy itself, his own service, had blithely watched our engineers pump dirty bilge water full of black oil over the side with little thought to the consequences. That awareness grew over his career.
And the impacts of environmental damage are huge, especially relating to climate change.
Enormous. He emphasizes that over 90% of the extra heat trapped by greenhouse gases ends up absorbed by the oceans. This leads to rising water temperatures, which fuels stronger storms and disrupts marine ecosystems. It causes thermal expansion of water, contributing to sea level rise, which combined with melting land ice threatens coastlines where nearly 3 billion people live. Low-lying island nations face existential threats.
Beyond climate change, there's direct pollution too. Oil spills.
We think of the big dramatic spills, like Saddam Hussein deliberately releasing 400 million gallons during the first Gulf War, or the Deepwater Horizon disaster spilling 200 million gallons in the Gulf of Mexico. Those are horrific. But Stavridis argues the steady, insidious oil pollution, from routine operational dumping, leaky pipelines, runoff from land, garbage maybe over 500 million gallons a year globally, is actually the bigger threat in the long run.
And it's not just oil.
No, there's chemical pollution too. Discharge of highly toxic materials, contaminated medical waste, sewage outflows, plastics, other non-biodegradable junk. It all ends up in the sea, accumulating, poisoning food chains.
It's a pretty grim picture he paints of this outlaw sea. Is there any hope?
He acknowledges the trends are worrying. As global population grows, the vast array of activities that damage the oceans will only increase. But he does offer some hope. He says, good news, we still have time to react. It's not too late, but the window might be closing.
So what's needed?
A significantly enhanced level of international cooperation, stronger enforcement of existing international agreements, like the UN Convention on the Law of the Sea, UNCLOS, which, ironically, the U.S. still hasn't fully ratified, negotiating new treaties and regimes to tackle specific problems like plastic pollution or IUU fishing, and massive public education, strategic communications, he calls it, to build awareness and political will. It requires everyone, governments, international bodies like the International Maritime Organization, IMO, and the private sector, shipping, fishing, energy companies, to step up.
It sounds like a monumental task, moving from an outlaw sea to a governed and protected one.
It absolutely is, but he argues it's essential for our collective future.
This seems like a good point to pivot towards his final thoughts on America's role and the future of sea power strategy. He talks about Mahan, right? Alfred Thayer Mahan.
Yes. You can't really discuss American sea power without talking about Mahan. His book, The Influence of Sea Power Upon History, published back in 1890, fundamentally shaped how the U.S. and indeed many other nations thought about navies and maritime strategy. Stavridis says Mahan's ideas still form the basis for American sea power today.
What were Mahan's core ideas?
Mahan identified key factors that determine a nation's potential for sea power. Things like geographical position, and the U.S. is incredibly fortunate with long coastlines on the Atlantic, Pacific, and increasingly relevant Arctic. Physical conformation, good harbors, navigable rivers, extent of territory, the size and character of the population, do they have an affinity for the sea, for trade, for naval service, and finally the character of the government, does the leadership understand the importance of sea power and invest in it?
And Mahan famously argued for a big fleet.
He did. His work was a siren call for a big, muscular fleet capable of commanding the sea lanes, protecting commerce, and projecting power ashore. Think Theodore Roosevelt's Great White Fleet. Sailing around the world, that was Mahan's vision made real. He contrasted sea powers, like Britain and potentially the U.S., with heartland powers, like Russia or Germany, arguing sea powers had inherent advantages in global influence.
But Mahan was writing over a century ago. How have things changed? How does Stavridis see modern strategy evolving beyond Mahan?
Well, Mahan obviously couldn't foresee everything. Modern naval warfare isn't just ship versus ship battles anymore. It's a combined arms contest, as Stavridis puts it. It involves long-range missile strikes, aircraft attacks from carriers or land bases, naval gunfire support, amphibious landings by Marines, coordination with Army units ashore. It's far more complex.
And technology Mahan couldn't dream of. Cyber? Space?
Exactly. Mahan, naturally enough, would have had no conception of the importance of cyber warfare, which is now critical for command and control, intelligence, even disabling enemy systems. Space-based assets are essential for navigation, communication, surveillance. Unmanned systems, aerial drones, surface vessels, underwater vehicles are increasingly integrated into naval operations.
Stavridis also highlights something specific about undersea cables, doesn't he?
Yes, this is a fascinating and often overlooked aspect. The overwhelming bulk of internet activity, financial data, communications, it doesn't travel via satellite. It travels along fiber optic cables laid on the seabed. These are critical infrastructure, but also potentially vulnerable.
Vulnerable how?
Advanced nations, he mentions, the U.S., Russia, China, have the capability to monitor, tap into, potentially disrupt, damage, or even destroy these cables. He points to accidental disruptions, like anchors dragging in Egypt in 2006, 2008, 2013, that effectively shut down internet services for large regions, showing the potential impact.
But there's an upside, too.
There is. He sees promise in new technologies to increase cable capacity and resilience. And creative ideas like using ships or aircraft as mobile networking hubs that could temporarily connect to these cables, offering high bandwidth communication in remote areas, potentially faster and cheaper than relying solely on satellites. He sees this as rife with potential for public-private partnerships.
So bringing all this together, what does a 21st century U.S. maritime strategy look like, according to the Admiral?
He traces the evolution of official U.S. strategy documents from the maritime strategy during the Cold War in 1986 to, from the sea in the post-Cold War 90s, up to a cooperative strategy for 21st century sea power from 2015. The core pillars remain: understanding the global security environment, maintaining forward presence and building partnerships, using sea power to support national security objectives, and designing the future force, getting the right ships, aircraft, and systems for all domain access.
What about fleet size? That's always a big debate.
He argues for maintaining an absolute ability to control the ocean approaches to our nation and suggests a fleet size of around 350 ships. The number fluctuates based on budgets and assessments, but that's the ballpark he mentions. He also discusses the existing numbered fleets: 6th Fleet in the Med, 5th in the Gulf, 7th in the Western Pacific, 4th covering Latin America or Caribbean. He even proposes potentially adding an 8th fleet focused solely on the Indian Ocean and maybe a 9th fleet for the Arctic as its importance grows.
And how should that presence be used? Any specific recommendations?
He gets quite specific. For the Mediterranean, he argues for increasing the 6th Fleet presence to a permanently deployed flotilla of at least 10 ships, given the instability in North Africa and the Levant, plus Russian resurgence. In the South China Sea, continued carrier presence, one based in Japan, more submarines based in Guam, Japan, and working very closely with allies like South Korea, Philippines, Japan, and partners like Vietnam, Taiwan, Malaysia, Singapore are key.
What about specific threats, like North Korea?
His approach involves increasing sanctions, deploying advanced missile defenses like DAO, Patriot, Aegis systems in South Korea and Japan to protect allies and U.S. forces, but also crucially maintaining open communication channels to avoid miscalculation and the familiar cycle of bad behavior, negotiations, concessions, and no change from Pyongyang.
And the Arctic?
Back to icebreakers, getting sufficient icebreakers, those 4 heavy and 4 medium ones, is priority 1. And working with coalition partners through the Arctic Council to keep sea lanes open and manage the region peacefully.
So it sounds like his updated vision of Mahan adds new layers.
Exactly. He argues the 21st century strategy expands the Mahanian construct by adding 3 crucial dimensions: international cooperation, formal alliances like NATO, but also informal partnerships, interagency efforts, working closely with other government bodies, especially the Coast Guard, And those public-private partnerships we discussed in areas like cyber, undersea cables, even logistics.
Put it all together, and what do you get?
You get what he calls a smart power approach for the seas. It's about using all the tools of national power, diplomatic, informational, military, economic, integrated, and applied smartly in the maritime domain. This, he believes, is essential for the U.S. to continue its global role, a voyage that is both personal to the mariners and essential to the nation.
Wow. We've covered a lot of water there, from the vast Pacific to the melting Arctic, from ancient battles to cyber threats.
We have. And I think what comes through so strongly from Admiral Stavridis' book, and hopefully our discussion, is that profound connection he draws between the lived human experience of being at sea, the challenges and triumphs of the individual sailor, and the huge, sweeping geopolitical forces that shape our world from the sea.
It's that constant interplay, isn't it? Trade, conflict, exploration, environmental change, all happening on or influenced by the oceans, constantly evolving. It makes you think. The Admiral notes how the world changed forever after Pearl Harbor, a sudden, unexpected strike from the sea. And you have to reflect on how similar unexpected strikes, whether they're military or maybe environmental disasters or even economic shocks propagating through global supply chains, how they continue to shape our world. And so often, they originate on or are amplified by this floating world of the oceans.
That's a sobering thought.
It is. So, thinking about everything we've discussed, drawing on the Admiral's insights, what stands out to you, the listener, as maybe the most critical challenge or perhaps the biggest opportunity that the oceans present for us in the 21st century? How will you view the next news story you see about tensions in the South China Sea, or melting ice in the Arctic, or even just a ship passing on the horizon, knowing the deep historical and human currents that lie beneath the surface? Something to consider.
Thank you for joining us on this deep dive into sea power.
Keep exploring, keep questioning, and continue to be well informed.